This story takes us back to a time when castles breathed and clocks had not yet learned to lie. To a distant land where among forests and stone walls stood a place forgotten by maps, but not by time. Here, beneath the arches of an old castle, shadows didn't merely rest, they waited. The stairs creaked not from the wind, but from memory. And behind closed doors, it wasn't the draft that whispered, but the spiral no one carved, yet everyone felt. People lived here, ordinary, weary, cautious. They carried wood, mended cloth, marked time by a bell that sometimes rang twice for no reason. They weren't looking for mysteries, but the mysteries were looking for them. The name of this place is now forgotten. But once, in those quiet years, something strange began. One day, a man vanished. Then a mirror disappeared. Then, time itself began to slip. The castle awoke not with bells or fanfare, but with the soft shuffle of slippers on old stone, the distant thud of bread dough being kneaded on oak, and the faint groan of iron hinges turned by sleepy hands. Each morning began the same way, and in that repetition lay comfort. In the quiet hours before sunrise, the castle seemed to hold its breath, and its keepers stirred like figures in a slow-moving clock. Marta, the head cook, descended the servant stairs long before the first light kissed the towers, a single beeswax candle in her hand, its flame shivering in the chill. Her boots made no sound on the stone steps she had walked for 43 years. She paused at each landing, peering into dark corners out of habit, nodding to the shadowy walls like to old acquaintances. The stones of the castle never changed, but Marta knew better than to trust them entirely. The kitchen hearth lay cold and dark as always. Marta opened its iron mouth, coaxing life into it with twigs, straw, and slow breath. Smoke curled like a cautious animal before catching. Soon came the scent of heat, of kindling wood, and yesterday's ash. Copper pots gleamed faintly in the firelight, and iron hooks swung softly from the ceiling as if remembering use. One by one, others arrived. Tomas with milk buckets from the stable, his hands already red from the chill. Elric the boy, bleary eyed and carrying leeks clumsily in both arms, and Rutha, oldest of the maids, with a basket of hardened bread to soak into pudding. There was also Yanis, the castle's seamstress, passing through with a basket of mended linens, and Dunric, the assistant steward, already reading from a tiny ledger even as he walked. They did not greet one another, but moved in harmony, each motion familiar, rehearsed, almost ceremonial. Above them, the castle stirred. Shutters creaked, bells echoed from the tower. Dust caught golden in shafts of morning light. Crows paced the outer walls like little guards on crooked feet. The air smelled faintly of straw, coal, and cold iron. Sir Roderick, steward of linens and time, marched down the corridor precisely as the second bell rang. His face betrayed no emotion, only the practiced expression of a man whose every hour had purpose. He adjusted curtains, counted napkins, and checked the alignment of chairs in the great hall. He noted a smudge on a silver goblet and wrote it down in his logbook without breaking stride. Each minute was logged, each anomaly recorded dot in his domain. Nothing was ever lost. Except that morning, something was... At precisely the sixth bell, King Aldrich's breakfast tray was prepared. It bore the usual: poached egg, stewed apple, a small roll, a sliver of cheese, and the king's silver spoon. Always the same spoon, engraved with a delicate raven, a gift from a visiting duke 30 years ago. The king used no other, but when Marta uncovered the cloth and reached for it, the spoon was gone. The moment stretched. The kitchen, usually humming, fell still. Marta stared, blinking once, then again. Tomas froze beside the stove. Elric let one leek roll from his arms to the floor with a soft thud. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hesitate. They searched first the tray, then the cupboard, then every drawer in the kitchen. Rutha insisted she had polished it herself the previous night, even pointing to the soft cloth she had used, still slightly damp. Tomas thought perhaps he'd seen it on the stone counter by the carrots. Marta said nothing, just frowned and wiped her hands repeatedly on the same corner of her apron. Perhaps, said Elric, quiet but clear, it was taken. Marta gave him a long look, the kind that silences boys for hours. But others looked at each other. Elric's words echoed silently, yet the idea, however small, planted itself. Who would take a spoon? And not just any spoon, the spoon. It was not simply used by the king, it was the king's breakfast, part of a ritual older than the boy who suggested theft. Word spread but softly. Whispers carried faster than footsteps in the castle. The guards were not summoned. The king was not yet told. Sir Roderick counted all the remaining silverware twice and confirmed one spoon missing. "Find it," he said simply, before the 8th bell. The search began in silence. Thomas started in the scullery, muttering to himself as he upended baskets of herbs and sniffed each one for clues, though he wasn't sure what a spoon might smell like. Rutha checked beneath the long dining benches, her knees creaking louder than the wood. Marta, always methodical, opened and closed each drawer in the main kitchen, then did it again in reverse order. Janice peered beneath a stack of folded linens. Dunrick wandered aimlessly, glancing at high shelves as though the spoon might float there. In the buttery, Elric knocked over a stack of wooden bowls while crawling under a barrel. Tomas interrogated the goose girl, who denied all involvement, though she did admit to once polishing a fork without permission. Marta opened every drawer twice and even checked beneath the old cat's cushion near the hearth. Nothing. Even Lady Corintha, the king's cousin, heard the tale and sent her maid to inspect the flower vases in the drawing room. In the great hall, 2 footmen discussed whether perhaps the spoon had been carried off by a jackdaw. "They like shiny things," said one. The other replied, "So do thieves." The tension among the staff was palpable but quiet. There was no panic, only a hushed kind of reverence, as if the spoon had disappeared of its own will. The castle's silence was different that morning. Hallways echoed longer, doors creaked slower. The very air seemed to lean inward, listening. By the 7th bell, the hush was complete. The king, still in his chambers, had sent no word. The absence of alarm was somehow more unsettling than if a trumpet had sounded. The castle itself felt unsettled, too quiet in places, too drafty in others. It was then that Rutha remembered something odd. "The library," she muttered. "I passed it before dawn. The door was ajar." The library was rarely visited in the mornings. Only Master Wilhelm, the old librarian, kept it company. But at that hour, he would still be breaking his fast in silence, as he had for decades. Elric was sent to investigate. He walked the long corridor with the caution of someone entering a church, and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the dust of 1,000 pages hung in sunbeams. Shelves towered like cliffs around him. The quiet was absolute. He tiptoed between reading tables and armchairs no one had sat in for years. Each book seemed to breathe softly in the half-light. And then, on a table near the back beside a thick volume on herbcraft, lay a silver spoon. It gleamed, untarnished, untouched. The raven on its handle looked straight up at Elric, as if to say, "What took you so long?" When Marta placed the spoon on the king's tray at last, no one spoke of where it had been. The king, slow and dignified, stirred his stewed apples and tasted a single bite. He said only, "Warm," and so the day continued. No culprits, no punishment. Just a spoon returned from silence. Yet the event settled like dust on everyone's thoughts, light but persistent. That evening, the castle resumed its rhythm. Marta scrubbed pots, Elric chased hens into their coop, and Rutha hummed an old song while folding napkins. Thomas paused at the window of the upper corridor and looked out over the herb garden, frowning slightly. Something was shifted. He couldn't say what dot. Later that night, Wilhelm closed the herbcraft book and frowned. He could not recall ever taking the spoon. And yet, there it had been. He pressed a hand against the worn wooden table, looked toward the rows of books behind him, and whispered to no one in particular, "I think the castle remembers." The morning began, as it always did, with dew on the stone paths and fog drifting between hedges like the castle's own slow breath. Oswald the gardener was among the first to rise, as he had been for over 40 years. He moved with purpose, boots firm on gravel, body bent slightly forward from years of tending roots and trimming walls. To him, the rhythm of plants was more trustworthy than people. At the southern beds, his foot caught midway to the earth. One of the moon orchids was gone. These weren't ordinary flowers. They were delicate things, pale as milk, opening only under the gentlest moonlight. 6 had been gifted to the castle by a botanist noble long forgotten, and the garden's southern edge had been carefully reshaped to shelter them. Now only 5 remained. The ground bore no disturbance, just a subtle absence, like a breath taken from the earth. Oswald crouched low, searching the soil for scratches, loose gravel, anything that could explain the theft. but nothing stirred. Not even the dew was disrupted. He inspected the garden gate, still locked. Only he and two others had keys, Sir Roderick and the herbalist, Agneta. Neither in his mind had reason to meddle. The orchids were rarely noticed by anyone but himself, and even then, only in passing. But Oswald had tended them for years. He pruned their stems with care, shielded them from frost with handmade covers, and measured their soil with a spoon passed down by his grandfather. He said nothing that day. But on the second morning, another orchid was gone. He began keeping records. He drew a crude map of the beds in his ledger, marking each flower's angle, bloom status, and root height. He logged temperature, humidity, wind direction. He walked the garden more slowly than usual, stopping to listen at intervals as if the plants might whisper an answer. The disappearance was too deliberate to be weather, too clean for wildlife. No prints, no chewed stems, just emptiness. On the third day, he paused beside the kitchen door. Voices carried inside, Marta's tired rhythm of chopping, Rutha's footsteps against stone. He considered saying something, his lips even parted, but the words felt brittle. The mystery wasn't yet large enough to share. That night, he placed a ribbon on one of the orchids, thin red thread, loosely tied around the base of the stem. It was an old trick. If the ribbon vanished, he'd know the act was no accident. If it remained, he might still believe in chance. The ribbon vanished by morning, so did the flower. By the fourth night, Oswald barely slept. The castle was too quiet, no wind, no owls. The frogs in the pond made no sound. The silence pressed against the shutters like fog. He rose in the dark and dressed without a lantern. The air outside was colder than it should have been, like breath drawn from old stone. His boots made little noise across the gravel path. The garden lay ahead, luminous in moonlight. The beds seemed to sleep, though he could feel their tension. The southern bed was visible even from the gate. Someone was there. A figure bent low, cloaked, unmoving. He stepped closer, slowly. It was Agneta. She wasn't startled. She didn't speak. She stood and turned, holding a bloom gently in one gloved hand. The ribbon trailed from the stem like a silkworm. Her other hand extended a small leather notebook, silent, offering inside. Faded handwriting, dated entries, references to herbal collections. The moon orchid appeared regularly, always gathered under specific conditions, before sunrise, under waning moons, on dates that matched an old medicinal calendar Oswald had never seen. The handwriting varied, some clean, others scribbled. The last pages bore unfamiliar signatures, smudges. None matched anyone still living in the castle. The next day, Oswald climbed the narrow spiral of the apothecary tower. The younger assistants greeted him with blinking confusion. None recognized the book. "We don't use that recipe anymore," one of them murmured, skimming its pages. "No one has for decades, maybe not since before the king's father." "Then what was she making?" Oswald asked. No one knew. He returned to the garden and stood before the remaining orchids. Their leaves twitched faintly, though the air was still. The ribbon stem left behind by Agneta was gone. The jar he used to hold rainwater beside the orchids had cracked overnight. The following evening, Agneta came to him. She said nothing, only placed the notebook in his hand again as if its weight might answer everything. He watched her walk away with the weariness of someone who had followed orders too long to remember why. That night, Oswald sat by the hearth and read every line of the notebook. He read it again, and then once more. No explanation revealed itself, only patterns, names long faded, recipes for drafts he'd never heard of, instructions for rituals never mentioned in the steward's records. The ribboned orchid sat in a jar on his windowsill for weeks. It never wilted. He didn't water it, he didn't touch it, but its petals remained full, its stem upright. Once, late at night, he swore it rotated slightly to face him. One night, unable to sleep, he placed the jar in the compost pile beside the hedge. By morning, it was back on his windowsill. He removed it again, buried it in soil this time, marked the spot with a flat stone. 2 days later, a new moon orchid grew in the same place, one more than had been planted. Oswald said nothing. He pruned the surrounding hedges, he polished his shears, and he left the flower alone. The east wing of the castle was a place few visited, and fewer still liked to speak of. Its corridors were narrow, the windows small, the light always faint even on the sunniest of days. Time seemed slower there, and dust settled faster than in the rest of the keep. It was the wing of long-forgotten nobles, guest chambers that no longer welcomed guests, and halls hung with portraits whose names had faded with the fabric of their frames. Wilhelm, the librarian, passed through it weekly, not out of desire but out of duty. A portion of the older manuscripts were stored in a small chamber at the end of the east wing, scrolls too brittle or obscure to be kept in the main collection. He would collect a few, take them back for copying, and return the previous batch, always placing them back in precise alphabetical order. It was on one such morning, early in the second month of frost, that Wilhelm noticed something missing. A portrait. The wall to the right of the small stairwell, opposite the lamp niche, had always held a long canvas. It was a strange piece, one he had paid little attention to over the years. A woman in an old-fashioned gown stood stiffly against a gray background, her eyes slightly too wide, her hands folded oddly low. No plaque had ever named her, but the portrait was unmistakable. Ugly in its composition, poorly lit, forgettable, yet permanent dot, and now it was gone. The hook remained. A faint rectangle of cleaner wall marked the absence. No scratches, no signs of force. It had simply vanished. Wilhelm rubbed his eyes, convinced he had missed something. He searched the nearby area. Perhaps the painting had been removed for cleaning. He checked with Dunrick, the assistant steward, who knew nothing of any maintenance orders. "I wouldn't move art," Dunrick had muttered, consulting his ledger. "Especially not that far down the wing. There's barely anyone left who walks those halls." The next morning, Wilhelm returned with a lantern and checked every hallway in the east wing. He found other portraits, dusty and askew, their subjects painted with the same flat brushstroke of obscurity, but the vanished woman did not appear in any of them, nor did he find the missing frame in storage or listed in any inventory record. Roderick himself insisted the catalog was complete. "Old things vanish," Roderick said. "That is the nature of old wings and older people." Wilhelm didn't argue, but he went back again and again, at first every few days, then every day. He began sketching from memory the face he only vaguely recalled. Round eyes, small mouth, something unsettled in her posture. He grew frustrated at how little he could remember. Her image slipped through the cracks of thought like dust between bricks. In the quiet of the library, he began looking for clues. He reviewed every record of East Wing restoration, old inventories, and servant rosters. He even consulted the Book of Lords and Lineages, though he knew the names on that wall were too minor or too discreet to have made it into royal records. The woman's portrait had never been documented. It was as though she had never been there at all. One evening, as the wind howled across the upper parapets and firelight flickered unevenly across the library shelves, Wilhelm found a small black envelope wedged in the pages of a genealogy book. The book itself was untouched for at least a decade, yet the envelope was clean. Inside, a single sheet of thick, yellowed parchment. No writing, just a hand-drawn face. Her face, the portrait's. He brought it to Rutha. She recognized it immediately. "She used to hang near the bell pull," she said. "I remember because I hated walking past her at night. Looked like she'd speak if I turned my back." "Do you know her name?" Wilhelm asked. Rutha shook her head. "None of us did. I think they used to call her the Silent Lady." "Why?" "She never moved." Rutha frowned, unlike the others. That night, Wilhelm took the drawing back to his chamber and locked it in a drawer. He heard nothing unusual until the third night, when he woke to the sound of gentle tapping on wood. Not knocking, more like fingernails or a ring brushing the back of a chair. He sat up. Silence. The room was still. But the desk drawer was open. The drawing was gone. He searched the room, under papers, behind books. Nothing. Just an empty drawer and the lingering scent of old varnish. He began sleeping with the lamp on. A week passed, then two. The portrait reappeared. It hung once more in its spot near the stairwell, perfectly aligned, perfectly still. But something had changed. Her hands were now clasped higher, at her waist rather than below, and her eyes seemed narrower, less wide, more knowing. Her mouth had a trace of curve it did not have before, not quite a smile, not quite anything. Wilhelm stood before it for a long time. He counted the folds of her gown, the pearls at her neck, one more than before. He was certain. He asked the steward if anyone had rehung the painting. The steward said no. He asked the maids if anyone had dusted it. The maids said they never touched the east wing. He even asked Agneta, the herbalist, if perhaps there was some memory draft or tea that could cause dreams to seem this real. She told him, "Dreams fade. You're describing something that remains." Wilhelm said nothing more. Each week, he checked the portrait. It never changed position again. But slowly, ever so slowly, he began to feel that the woman was watching, not with malice, but with memory. Marta was the first to mention it that winter. She told Oswald one morning over tea that she had heard a lullaby while climbing the northern stairs to retrieve a copper basin. No one was there, she said, but the melody kept going, like it was circling the stones. Oswald nodded. It's not the first time, he said. I've heard it in the greenhouse. Once, years ago. I thought it was wind, but there was no wind. Rutha, overhearing, paused while slicing bread. They say the song was written by the queen who never bore a child. She used to hum it walking the upper corridors alone, always after midnight. When she passed, the halls remembered. It could have remained a story, a faint and private mystery, if not for Elric. The boy was curious, as boys are, and emboldened by the idea that mysteries could be followed like foxes through woods. When he heard Rutha's tale, he asked questions. When he got few answers, he began listening. The first time he heard it, he was alone in a laundry corridor past midnight. He had crept there hoping to catch the sound, heart pounding, ears strained. When it came, it did not scare him. It comforted him. The melody was simple, delicate. 5 notes, repeated and then reversed. He returned the next night, and again the next. Each time the song arrived at midnight precisely, never early, never late. He told Marta. She told him not to linger. He told Wilhelm. The librarian said little, but that night, Wilhelm left a blank notebook by his bedside. Over the next week, Elric mapped where the song moved. He carried scraps of parchment and drew lines. One night near the bell tower, one night beneath the chapel floor, another, startlingly, in the servants' stairwell where no one lingered. He wrote down what he could recall of the melody. It was always the same. He tried humming it to Rutha, who shook her head. It's not meant to be repeated, she said. It's meant to be heard once, and then let go. On the 7th night, he brought a tuning fork and struck it at the start of the melody. The tone it made was almost in harmony, but not quite. The dissonance hummed in his ribs. On the 10th night, something changed. The song was slower, not sadder exactly, but altered, as if someone were taking longer to remember it. Elric felt a pressure behind his ears as it played. When it stopped, he looked up and saw something that chilled him. The torchlight down the hallway flickered, though there was no wind, and every stone behind him was slightly damp, as if something heavy had just passed by. The next day, he found Wilhelm again and gave him his sketches. The librarian reviewed them in silence, then placed the notes in a folder and told Elric to wait. That evening, Wilhelm climbed to the highest tower room, unused, dusty, forgotten. He brought a lute that hadn't been tuned in years. He waited. At midnight the song came. He tried to match it, but the strings sounded foreign. He tried to write it, but his ink bled strangely on the page, like the paper resisted the memory. Even the melody, when spoken aloud, seemed to vanish before reaching the edge of the ear. The next day, Wilhelm consulted the old hymnals. Nothing matched, not in melody, not in structure. But buried within the margins of one water-damaged psalter, he found a scribbled note. She hums only when the castle sleeps. Let no one write her song. It belongs to silence. That night, Elric did not appear at supper. He was found at dawn, asleep in the long gallery, shivering beneath a tapestry. He had followed the song, he said. Followed it deeper than he meant to. It had led him behind a panel in the wall. He remembered a narrow stair, a corridor with walls covered in moss, and then nothing. No footsteps, no wind, just the song. When he awoke, the air had smelled like roses. After that night, the melody changed once more. Now it began further away, almost out of reach. It circled less frequently. Some nights it did not come at all. Wilhelm asked Rutha if she had ever followed it. Once, she said, long ago. I found a locked door. When I tried to open it, the song stopped. I never went back. Marta said the lullaby reminded her of something her grandmother sang to her as a child, but she could never recall the words. Agneta, the herbalist, once claimed the melody came from the walls themselves, not from any human throat. Stone remembers, she said, and sometimes it mourns. One evening, Wilhelm placed a single candle on the step beneath the bell tower where Elric had first heard the song. The next morning, the candle was unburnt, but the wax had melted into a spiral. Later that week, Elric sat in the corner of the kitchen, absent-mindedly tapping the rhythm of the melody on the stone floor. Every time he struck the fifth beat, the pantry door behind him creaked slightly, though no wind passed through. Rutha noticed it, and her hands stiffened around her ladle. In a quiet moment, Marta asked Wilhelm, "Do you think it wants to be remembered?" Wilhelm did not answer. But that night he left a bowl of water in the hallway, beneath the arch where the melody once lingered longest. In the morning the water was frozen, though the night had been warm. The song, when it returned again, came not from the walls, but from within the fireplaces. The flames flickered to its rhythm. Elric watched one such fire crackle gently, and as the notes played, the embers danced into the shape of the spiral he had seen once before. Weeks passed. The air grew warmer. Spring threatened the frost. The song did not return. Then one night, Marta woke to silence, true silence, and for the first time in years she felt something missing. She rose and walked to the hallway. There, folded carefully on the lowest step, was a scrap of parchment. On it were 5 notes, drawn in ink so fine they looked like hair. The notes matched the song. The final one was smudged. She held it to her chest, and in the stone behind her she thought she heard someone breathe. The southern tower of the castle was the shortest of the 4, and the quietest. It had no bell, no garrison, and no stair to the ramparts. It was round and squat and built from darker stone, older and rougher than the others. No one remembered why it was constructed differently, but it stood nonetheless, unmoving, like a sentinel watching the edge of memory. At its base was a door, heavy, iron-bound, and always locked. The door had no keyhole. Roderick the steward passed it once a week during his rounds. He always paused before it, adjusted his sleeve cuffs, then continued on. No one asked why, not even Marta or Wilhelm. The locked door was as much a part of the castle as the fireplaces or the drafts. One morning, however, Oswald noticed something strange. The vines he'd cut back from the tower wall 3 days before had grown over the door again, not just hanging, but woven, as if purposefully braided into the iron lattice. He clipped them again, but the next day they were back, thicker this time, and glistening slightly, as if dew clung to them even under clear skies. When he tried to pull the vines free by hand, they resisted more than expected, as if they held the memory of being rooted. He mentioned it to Rutha, who said quietly, "It's growing again." "What is?" "The forgetting." He stared at her. "That door," she whispered, "does not open from our side." That night, Wilhelm retrieved an old ledger from the archive, records from when the castle was built. He found 3 pages that mentioned the southern tower, all of them annotated in the same faded hand, sealed, as ordered. Not to be disturbed. No names, no dates, just silence. Wilhelm consulted a second source, an aged architectural diagram of the original keep. The tower was drawn as hollow, no floors beyond the entrance, no rooms. Just a stair spiraling into a blank outline. Meanwhile, Elric grew restless. Predictably fascinated by anything hidden, he lingered near the tower after his chores, sometimes standing so long in the grass that ants climbed his boots. He swore he heard the door breathing. He asked Marta if he could explore the base. She told him not to. Roderick said no. Agneta gave him a bundle of rosemary and told him to stay in the sunlight. Still, the boy watched the tower. He noticed the birds never landed on it. He noticed cats avoided its base. He noticed that, in the afternoon, the stone gave off a faint hum, low and steady, like a cord stretched across centuries. One night, as he stared from the eastern garden, he thought he saw a faint light flicker behind the narrow window slit of the 3rd level, but the tower had no upper rooms. That week, Marta dreamed of a spiral stair lined with mirrors. She told no one, but awoke with a sore ankle as if she had walked all night. Rutha left a string of iron keys outside her chamber door, despite none of them fitting anything in her quarters. Wilhelm began waking each morning with one of his books on the floor, open to a page referencing darkness, dissent, or silence. Then 2 of the kitchen knives went missing. The drawer was found closed, untouched. But on the cutting board, someone had carved a spiral, and then one evening, the door was ajar, not open, just not closed. Elric stood staring at the inch of darkness beyond the threshold. He said later he didn't mean to touch it, only to look. But the wind pushed, or the hinge shifted, and the door opened with the sound of stone inhaling. Inside was a spiral stair. Descending. He returned the next day with a candle and a satchel of chalk. He marked the wall every few steps. He counted them. 34 down and then a landing. The stair turned. He went farther. 48, 60. The flame trembled more. The walls narrowed. The air grew colder, moist. Not stale exactly, but dense. He began to hear something. Not the song from before. Not voices. Breathing. Not his own. He climbed back quickly and didn't return for 2 days. When he told Wilhelm, the librarian asked no questions, only wrote down the number, 60. The third night, Elric had a dream. A door inside the stair opened, revealing a mirror that showed not his face, but Marta's, older, paler, eyes closed. When he woke, there were wet footprints near his bed, though he had not left his room. On the 5th morning, 2 cats were found curled at the tower's base, cold, unmoving, eyes open, no wound, no sign of struggle. That week, Roderick posted a plank across the door and sealed it with wax. He said it was for safety, structural concern. Oswald hammered the nails in himself. As he did, he swore he felt the door pulsing beneath his knuckles. But that night, Marta saw candlelight moving behind the tower window. There was no floor at that level. The following morning, the vines were back, thicker than ever, blooming tiny white flowers that no one could identify. That evening, Wilhelm returned to the library and pulled out every record relating to sealed doors, forgotten rooms, and forbidden staircases. He found a passage in a chronicle titled Whispers of the Southern Wing, where a former court scribe noted, "Some doors do not lock to keep us out, but to keep what lies within from remembering the world above." That night, he dreamt of the tower, only it was taller, and the stair ascended instead of descending. At the top, he saw a figure without a face, holding an hourglass filled with ash. When he woke, his boots were damp. The scent of moss clung to the sheets. 3 days later, Elric placed a sprig of rosemary at the foot of the door and whispered something he never repeated. The next morning, the sprig was gone. In its place was a single white feather, perfectly clean, resting on the cold stone. By then, the tower was never truly silent. Even when unvisited, a faint vibration ran through its walls, subtle enough to miss unless you placed your palm to the stone. Oswald tested it once, and the hum matched the rhythm of his own pulse, until it didn't. For a moment it beat twice as fast, then stopped entirely. Rutha claimed she saw shadows moving across the curtain in her room, shadows shaped like stairs. No light source nearby, no movement outside, only the outline of a turning spiral. One afternoon, Agneta scattered salt in a circle around the tower, muttering an old protective charm no one had heard her speak before. When asked, she only said, "Something is learning, something is waking up." Marta, cleaning the upper windows, dropped a cloth into the courtyard and saw it disappear before it hit the stones. Not float, disappear, like falling into an unseen crack in the world. That evening, Wilhelm opened a folio of old ballads and found tucked between the pages a song written in a hand he didn't recognize, with no title. Just a single line beneath the notes, "The stair remembers those who walk it." Later that night, a scratching sound came from behind the hearth in the servants' hall. Not mice, something slow, deliberate. They bricked up the fireplace the next morning. By the end of the month, the tower had become impossible to ignore. Candles blew out when placed too near it. Bread left outside its door came back slightly warm, as if someone, or something, had held it close. The vines now stretched halfway up the wall, their blossoms faintly pulsing like breathing. And still the door remained closed. Or did it? Some swore they had passed by and seen it cracked again. Others denied it, but none dared open it. Then, one fog-bound morning, a 6th spiral appeared, this time not carved or drawn, but shaped by the gravel stones in the garden path. Perfect, precise. No one claimed to have made it. That night, Elric did not return to his bed. His boots were left by the tower. One was filled with water. No tracks led away. Marta found his candle stub the next morning beside the stair. It was still burning, though its wick had vanished. They did not open the door again. They did not speak of it. But each night someone left rosemary on the step. It began with a violet. In the middle of winter, with the ground hard as stone and the trees skeletal against gray skies, a single violet bloomed in the courtyard. No one noticed it the first day. On the second, Marta paused while carrying firewood and knelt to look. The flower was bright, its color deep as ink, petals wide, leaves unmarred by cold. She called Oswald, who bent over it and frowned. "It shouldn't be here," he muttered. "It shouldn't be alive." By the end of the week, more had appeared. Not just violets now. white crocuses, orange lilies, and thin curling vines that wound around stones and froze the frost itself. The flowers bloomed in perfect spirals. The garden, usually dull and bristled with leafless shrubs in winter, began to glow faintly at dusk. Not light in the usual sense, more a presence, like the memory of daylight refusing to die. Rutha said it smelled like a chapel after Mass. Wilhelm thought it was older than prayer. In the moonlight, the garden seemed deeper than it was, as if its flowers reached into another layer of the world. Trees cast shadows where there were no trees. The stone walls of the castle grew ivy that hadn't been there during the day. Agneta harvested a few petals, cautiously. When dried, they crumbled into fine salt. She refused to touch them again. Then came the whispers. They started at the edge of the courtyard, low, indistinct voices, like a gathering in another room muffled by thick walls. Sometimes a single voice rose above the others, a child humming, a woman sighing, a name spoken softly and never repeated. The whispers shifted with the wind, curling down hallways, slipping under doors. Roderick walked with a lantern even at noon. Wilhelm began taking notes each morning, what flowers had opened, what colors they showed, whether the spiral had shifted. His sketches became increasingly detailed, bordering on obsessive. One day, Marta found a drawing he'd left in the kitchen. The spiral in it extended beyond the garden and traced the entire layout of the castle. That night, the frost did not come. Though the temperature dropped, the garden remained untouched. The grass glistened as if dusted in glass, but not frozen. The stone path warmed slightly beneath bare feet. Roderick forbade anyone from entering the garden after sundown. No one listened. One by one, people began slipping in. Some stayed minutes, others hours. Elric's name returned on their lips without prompting. It was as if the garden had grown in response to his disappearance, or perhaps because of it. One evening, Agneta left a vial of lavender oil on a stone near the violet. It vanished by morning. In its place was a smooth black stone, warm to the touch. Wilhelm placed a blank book in the grass and opened it to the center. The next day, 2 pages had filled themselves in, a diagram of roots spiraling down and inward, names etched among them like family trees of things that never lived. The castle hens stopped laying eggs. The dogs howled only when near the west wall. One window refused to frost, no matter how cold the wind. And yet, despite the wonder, unease crept in Marta, found her shadow behaving oddly, stretched at strange angles, sometimes flickering though she stood still. Rutha claimed her reflection in the fountain showed her blinking when she was not. Oswald's boots left prints that led in 2 directions. A thick scent of earth began seeping through the floorboards. The kitchen's herbs wilted and regrew twice in a single day. The tapestries along the corridor gathered dust in perfect spiral patterns. The garden grew, not in size but in presence. It spilled inward. The scent of blooms filled the halls. Pollen dusted windowsills. One morning, frost appeared inside the glass, spiral-shaped. Then one night, Wilhelm heard music coming from the garden. Soft strings, a lullaby without a melody, played by no instrument he knew. He stood at the upper window listening, the sound both beautiful and unbearable. The next morning, petals had blown into the great hall. They lay scattered on the dining table and beneath the benches, though no windows had been opened. Later that week, Agneta entered the garden just before sunset and did not return until dawn. When asked what she saw, she whispered, "Roots growing upward." Wilhelm found a petal pressed between the pages of a book he'd not touched in years. Its scent was sweet and unfamiliar, but when he inhaled too deeply, he saw Elric's face behind his closed eyes, walking down a spiral stair lit with candlelight. Roderick began having dreams, fractured visions of vines climbing the walls from inside, of a spiral blooming on the ceiling above his bed. He stopped sleeping in his room. Children in the village down the hill began speaking of flowers blooming on their windowsills overnight. No seeds planted, no soil, just blossoms, cold to the touch. One girl claimed the flowers whispered names to her in her sleep. Her father said it was only wind. But when he checked her room, he found petals scattered across her pillow, each marked with a tiny spiral. Then on the final day of the month, the garden bloomed in full, every flower open, every petal perfect. The spiral pulsed faintly. Marta entered before sunrise. She stayed until the bell rang noon. When she emerged, she held a single stem, a flower no one could name. "He's still walking," she whispered. No one asked who that night the frost returned, but only outside the walls. Within the garden, the warmth remained, pulsing like a second heart beneath the castle. But the warmth was not comforting. It carried with it a weight, a pressure, as though the castle sat atop a breathing thing. The walls themselves sometimes felt soft to the touch, like living bark instead of stone. And the deeper into the keep one walked, the more the silence pressed against the ears, thick and woolen, like the hush before a snowfall. In the cellar, jars of preserves burst in the night, the contents bubbling and steaming though there was no fire. The stone floor was damp, not with water, but with something thicker, dark and root-scented. Wilhelm wrote less now, but what he did write made less sense. Curving lines, no longer in his usual neat hand-covered pages. At breakfast, he stared through the walls, mumbling the names of long-dead kings and strangers no one knew. Rutha began sleeping in the tower closest to the stables, as far from the garden as possible. She claimed she saw leaves growing through the gaps in the stones of her old chamber wall. Marta walked with a slight limp, though she said nothing of it. Her steps always led her back to the edge of the courtyard, where she stood for long minutes watching the spirals and the flower beds shift. They moved subtly, like constellations rearranging themselves one star at a time. The villagers who visited brought offerings, bowls of cream, braided grass, carved wooden spirals. Some claimed they felt lighter after kneeling by the gate. Others left with empty eyes. No one remembered planning the garden. The attic room had been locked for decades. No one remembered placing anything inside it, nor why the key had been hung above the hearth wrapped in linen, as if to forget it without truly losing it. When the frost began seeping into the upper corridors, Wilhelm took the key down without speaking. He did not ask permission. The others watched him go, but no one stopped him. The attic stair was narrow, the ceiling low. Dust curled in the corners like sleeping things. Each step creaked with the weight of time. At the top, the door waited, plain, old, unremarkable, except for the circular iron bolt in its center. Wilhelm hesitated, then slid the bolt aside. The air behind the door was warm, not the warmth of fire or sun, but of breath held too long. Inside was a single item, a mirror, oval, framed in tarnished silver, taller than a man. The glass had no dust, though the room was thick with it. No reflection showed within it at first, only a dull shimmer, like deep water under clouds. The walls were bare stone, but the floor was covered in overlapping rugs, threadbare and faded, patterned in swirling motifs. Above, the beams of the roof bent slightly inward, as if pulled toward the mirror. A crack in the far wall let in a pencil of light, which curved unnaturally as it touched the glass. As Wilhelm stepped closer, the shimmer shifted. It did not show him. It showed the garden. Not the garden as it was, but as it could be, or had been. The flowers were moving, swaying, though there was no wind. Beneath them, roots glowed with pale green light. Elric stood in the center, turning slowly, eyes closed. In the sky above him was not the sun, but something more like an eye, open, unblinking. Behind him, shadowy figures stood in a circle, faces blurred, hands extended toward the earth. Wilhelm could not tell if they were helping Elric or holding him in place. When Wilhelm blinked, the vision was gone. The mirror reflected the room, and him. Then it blinked, not him. The reflection. He stumbled back, nearly falling down the attic steps. He closed the door and locked it again, wrapping the key once more in the old linen. But it was too late. That night, reflections shifted across the castle. In basins, windows, polished plates, things were seen that did not match the movements of those who looked into them. Marta saw herself brushing her hair with the wrong hand. Rutha's reflection mouthed words she hadn't spoken. Oswald's image turned its back when he approached. A small mirror in Agnetta's cupboard cracked down the center when no one was near. They covered the mirrors, draped cloth over metal, refused to look, but reflections found them. A silver spoon bent slightly when left too near the hearth. A pool of water collected in Marta's boot despite being dry inside and out. Wilhelm's candle cast two shadows. Even the moonlight changed. It no longer fell in straight lines through the windows. It warped, spiraled gently as if remembering another sky. The fire in the great hearth no longer crackled as it once did. Now it hissed as if boiling something deep within. And in its flickering light, shadows danced that had no visible cause. One morning, a child from the village came with her mother to deliver milk. She froze when she looked into the basin in the great hall. "That's not me," she said simply. Her mother led her away without speaking. That evening, Wilhelm tried to read his notes from the attic, but the words swam. Letters reversed themselves. Some lines vanished when reread. That week, the attic door unlatched itself twice. Each time, the bolt was untouched. Footprints, bare, damp, were found on the wooden stairs. They ended at the mirror. The house cat refused to enter the upper floor. It hissed at closed doors and paced in circles beneath the beams. Finally, they carried the mirror to the courtyard. It took 6 of them. It was heavier than it should have been. As they moved, it seemed to hum softly just below the threshold of hearing. They set it beside the spiral bed of lilies and violets. The glass turned black. Marta whispered a prayer that didn't match any faith known. Rutha placed a drop of blood on the frame. The mirror did not react. But that night, the spiral in the garden widened, slowly, deliberately. The following morning, dew formed only in the shapes of eyes. On windows, leaves, even skin. In the well, reflections moved before the water settled, and deep in the sky, a second moon flickered into being, visible only in reflection. Its eye did not blink. It began with a sound no one recognized. A soft chime, clear, resonant, and impossibly slow. It echoed through the corridors on the first morning of the new month. At the 13th stroke of noon, there was no clock in the castle capable of making it. The tower bell struck 12 as it always had, and yet, after the silence that followed, came a low and lingering toll. One final note that did not belong. The chime returned the next day. Again at noon. Again after 12. Again 13. Wilhelm was the first to investigate. He wandered the halls with his ledger, pausing to note temperature shifts and the smell of iron that followed each toll. The sound did not come from above or below. It came from everywhere and nowhere. On the 3rd day, the clock in the dining hall, long silent, its hands frozen for years, ticked once at the stroke of 13. By the 4th day, all timepieces in the castle began drifting. Some ran fast, others lost hours. Marta's pocket watch reversed direction without warning. A sundial placed in the courtyard cast 2 shadows. When the servants tried to reset the clocks, they found the hands resisted them. Agneta said she felt something watching through the gears. The grandfather clock in the music room began chiming at odd hours. 7 strokes at dawn, then again at midnight. One morning it played a tune no one had heard before, a slow dirge that left the listeners cold and speechless. Time, it seemed, was not moving forward. It was circling back, and the spiral had always been a clock. But the realization did not bring peace. The following morning, time fractured entirely. The sun rose in the west and set in the east. Bells rang before being struck. Words spoken in the kitchen were heard in the stables moments before they were said. The firewood split itself. Bread burned before it baked. Children in the village aged and then shrank again. Rutha's hair turned white, then black, then white again within a single hour. The pages in Wilhelm's ledger wrote and unwrote themselves, curling like fern fronds as lines vanished mid-sentence. Objects shifted subtly throughout the castle. Chairs turned to face the wrong way. Windows overlooked gardens that did not exist. A staircase turned 1 step longer each time it was climbed. The golden watch Marta had found no longer ticked. It pulsed, glowing faintly beneath her pillow. She dared not destroy it. Once she tried to bury it in the courtyard soil. The next morning, it reappeared on her windowsill, wet with dew, ticking backward. Agneta spoke only in questions. Oswald moved in loops, repeating his day in fixed patterns. Wilhelm scratched symbols into the walls, spirals intersecting with clocks, calendars crossed with roots. He whispered numbers to no one. The castle itself shifted. Rooms changed order. Doors vanished. One hallway looped endlessly until Marta realized she was walking past the same crack in the wall for the 9th time. Roderick disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, his voice echoed as if 2 versions of him spoke at once. Then came the 17th chime. It struck once, then twice, then 5 more times, and then a final thunderous peal that cracked the glass in the northern windows. No one moved. No one spoke. The sun stalled above the castle, not moving, not burning, simply watching. Time had gathered itself into a spiral so tight, it collapsed. That evening, the courtyard flowers all opened in unison. The spiral in the frost pulsed like a living thing, and Marta, alone, watching the golden watch throb on her palm, understood. The clock was not broken. It was waking up. That night, no one slept. The walls groaned softly, as if something beneath the castle had begun to turn. A low vibration settled into the stone, a steady rhythmic pulse, like the ticking of a distant heart. Wilhelm sat at his desk, staring at the candle, which burned without shrinking. Its flame leaned sideways, flickering toward the east. His pen moved on its own, scratching symbols he didn't recognize. When he blinked, they vanished. In the chapel, Agneta sat facing the altar, though she no longer prayed. The stained glass window above her flickered like a lantern underwater, each shard showing a different season, a different century. The crucifix on the wall turned upside down, not violently, but slowly, like the swinging of a pendulum. Rutha stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching frost climb up the vines instead of down. She spoke aloud a memory she had not yet lived, a voice whispering her name from a garden that hadn't grown. The villagers began to speak of loops in the road, paths that circled back where they shouldn't. One girl stepped into her home and found herself outside again. Chickens walked backward, and rain fell upward for a full minute before reversing course. Oswald rang the bell at dawn and heard it echo from beneath his feet. A small spiral formed in the surface of the moat, slowly spinning, drawing leaves inward, as if waiting. The golden watch in Marta's hand stopped pulsing. It opened, revealing no gears, just a tiny mirror, and in its reflection a version of Marta with her mouth open in a scream she had not yet made. She closed the lid. Later that day, a door appeared in the eastern wall, one none of them had seen before. It was carved with clock faces, all showing different times, and above the frame a spiral etched into black wood, still wet with dew. They did not open it, not yet. But by sunset they all dreamed of what lay beyond. They gathered at dawn. The door was still there, dark wood, etched in spirals, clock faces, tiny carvings of vines and moons. It hadn't aged overnight. If anything, it looked newer, too new. The dew still clung to it, though no other surface was wet. No one had touched it, but they'd all dreamt of it. In their sleep, they had walked through it. Marta had seen herself stepping into a corridor lined with mirrors that didn't reflect her, but versions of herself in different clothes, different ages. Rutha remembered a hallway that stretched into mist, where each door bore her name. Wilhelm saw a staircase that coiled down into candlelight where time moved backward, and Elric stood at the bottom, facing away. They said nothing of their dreams to each other, but still, they gathered. Wilhelm was the first to reach out. The moment his fingers touched the iron ring of the handle, the door sighed, not creaked, sighed, as if it had been waiting to breathe. It opened without resistance. Inside, darkness, not absence of light, but an active dark, thick, velvet, heavy. They stepped through. The corridor was not part of the castle. Not exactly. The stones were familiar, yet wrong, like imitations carved from memory. The air smelled of lavender and dust, of candle wax and frozen earth. As they walked, time unraveled. The clock they carried spun its hands in wide, lazy circles. Wilhelm's hair grew an inch. Rutha's braids shortened. Agneta's shadow flickered twice in opposite directions. Rooms opened off the hall. In one, a library with no books, only shelves and the sound of pages turning. In another, a garden under glass, where the spiral bloomed in fire-colored flowers that burned cold. One room held only a mirror, and inside it, Wilhelm saw a boy reading, a younger version of himself, who looked up and said, "You're late." They found a chamber filled with ticking, hundreds of clocks suspended from the ceiling by threads of smoke. They spun without rhythm. One burst into flame and reformed from ash without a sound. Another door led to a room with a dry riverbed. Stonefish lay where water should have run, mouths open in silent song. As Marta passed, they turned their heads to follow her. In one alcove, Agneta found a table with a chessboard mid-play. She reached to move a piece and saw her hand wrinkle, then smooth. The game played itself backward. They passed a room that showed the courtyard, except it was night, and in the spiral stood Elric, watching the stars fall upward. In the deepest chamber, they found a clock, not a normal one. This was a construct of wood and stone and bone. Its face was a spiral. Its hands were needles. It did not tick. It breathed. Marta stepped forward. The golden watch in her pocket grew hot. The spiral pulsed. The air thickened. The walls bent inward as if listening. And then, in a moment stretched too long, the clock spoke, not aloud, but inward. Into each of them, Your time has been borrowed. Now it must be returned. They did not know what that meant, but each of them felt something loosen inside. The memory of a choice they hadn't made, a life they hadn't lived, a debt paid in silence. And behind the spiral clock, a new door began to open. It glowed faintly, rimmed in gold light. A wind rushed through the chamber, not cold, not warm, but familiar. The scent of rosemary and ink, the sound of distant chimes. Marta took a step forward. Time trembled, then stopped. They felt it, not as silence, but as absence. Even their own breathing seemed borrowed. The walls no longer stood still. They leaned slightly, dreamlike, as if the space around them were exhaling. The glowing door behind the spiral clock opened fully. But beyond it was not a room, it was a landscape. The horizon tilted inward, and the sky above was not a sky but a clock face. Giant hands moved across clouds shaped like runes. Beneath them stretched a valley of mirrors, each standing upright, rooted in the earth like trees. One by one they passed through. Marta stepped onto a path of polished stone. Her reflection ran ahead of her, then slowed to match her stride. Wilhelm bent to touch a puddle and saw Elric's eyes looking back. Rutha called out, and her voice echoed in a dozen directions at once, none of them her own. They moved as a group, but the world around them shifted. Sometimes the trees were upright clocks. Sometimes they were human-shaped and ticking. They passed a grove where moths circled candles that never burned out. A tower grew from the ground like a spine, and inside it time ran backward, their steps unmade dust. Agneta whispered that she remembered this place, not from a dream, from before her birth. Wilhelm found a note in his coat pocket that he hadn't written. It read, "Don't follow the bells." They followed anyway. At the center of the valley stood a dais made of bone-white stone, spiraled like a seashell. In its middle, a well, not deep, not dark, glowing faintly. From within came the sound of breathing. Marta leaned in. She saw herself, as a child in the castle garden, as an old woman holding the same golden watch, as something else, shapeless but watching. A loop of moments braided around a spiral. One by one they looked into the well. Each saw a version of their time, choices taken, regrets rippling, years stretched and folded. Wilhelm cried. Agneta laughed. Rutha turned away. And then the voice returned. Return what was borrowed. The spiral clock chimed 13 times. The mirrors cracked. The valley bent inward. And time finally began to unravel. The valley convulsed as if struck by a silent tremor. Reflections in the mirror trees began to flicker, first calmly, then wildly, jumping between versions of people and places that had never met. The skies overhead turned to brass, the runes glowing faintly as if counting down. Marta stumbled, catching herself on a vine made of braided hair. It pulsed beneath her fingers. Nearby, Wilhelm bent over, clutching his stomach. His shadow split from him and walked away, disappearing behind a ridge. Hold your shape, Rutha muttered through clenched teeth. Hold your time. But time would not be held. The dais at the valley's center cracked. From beneath it rose a figure, not of flesh, not of spirit. A sculpture of spirals and hollow bones, faceless, wrapped in timepieces whose hands all pointed inward. The breathing from the well stopped. In its place came a low humming, a chord that did not belong to any known music, yet made their teeth ache and blood stir. Borrowed time, the figure said, not aloud, but into the marrow of their bones. You built a world on it. It raised one elongated hand. The spiral on its chest turned once. Marta felt the golden watch on her body grow colder and heavier. She looked down. It was no longer gold. It was turning to glass. Inside, instead of gears, she saw scenes, moments lived and not lived, her mother's face, a road never taken, her first steps, her last. Wilhelm tried to speak, but his voice came out as chimes. Agneta clutched her arms as though holding herself in place. Rutha stepped toward the figure. What do you want from us? She said, her voice echoing twice. The figure opened its chest, not with violence, but ceremony. Inside, a void full of ticking. Return what was borrowed. With those words, time began to peel away from them like skin from fruit. Marta aged and de-aged in pulses, flickering through memories and futures. Wilhelm glowed faintly, becoming transparent, as though history were choosing whether or not he had ever existed. Agneta reached into her pocket and pulled out a dried flower, the one Elric had once given her. She dropped it into the well. The humming slowed. Rutha stepped to the edge and whispered something inaudible. Her shadow bowed and vanished. and the spiral, engraved into the valley itself, began to lift, rising from the land like a stair upward into the turning sky. The figures stepped aside. Climb. They did, one by one, into the spiral, into the sky, through the hours they had never lived and the ones they wished they hadn't. And the clock above them turned once more. The spiral's staircase rose impossibly high. Each step shimmered with time's residue, moments shed by those who climbed before. The stairs were not stone but memory. Each footfall sounded different, a heartbeat, a ticking clock, a breath caught in grief. Above them stretched the sky clock, its hands moving so slowly they could no longer tell if time passed or paused. The higher they climbed, the lighter they felt, not in body, but in being. Agneta whispered. She no longer remembered her own voice. Wilhelm carried only a piece of parchment now, blank on one side, glowing faintly on the other. Marta held the glass watch, now completely still. Rutha counted every step aloud. When she reached 12, she stopped. The 13th stair was not a stair. It was a threshold. It opened. They entered a chamber vast and circular, suspended in the heart of the sky. No walls, only the illusion of stars, turning like gears. At its center stood a spiral pedestal, atop which floated a small, dark sphere. Around it circled visions, births, funerals, laughter, war, histories real and imagined. Each character saw something different. Marta saw her brother Elric, standing unharmed, holding a spiral-shaped candle that never melted. Wilhelm saw the castle before it was built, just a clearing surrounded by a ring of standing stones. Agneta saw a version of herself in a mirror, smiling, an expression she hadn't made in years. Rutha saw no one but felt someone watching. The sphere pulsed. A voice, not the same as before, rose from it, layered like a chorus. Time is not your prison. You are its keeper. Then the visions shattered like glass, and the room twisted inward. The group fell, not downward, but inward, into themselves. They passed through loops of memory, relived losses, choices, wrongs unrighted, and they emerged, changed. The chamber was still. The spiral pulsed once more, slowly, calmly. Marta approached it. She placed the glass watch at its base. The spiral unraveled. Above them, the sky clock stopped ticking, then restarted, quietly, gently, and the 13th hour passed. But the moment did not end. Instead, a stillness held them. Not peace, but pause, like the breath between lightning and thunder. The stars surrounding the chamber began to drift, uncoupling from their gear like constellations. They floated untethered, whispering light across the air. One by one they fell, not down, but into the center of the spiral. There, where the sphere had rested, now rose a staircase of light. A voice whispered, "This is not the end. This is return." They climbed. Each step reshaped memory. Marta remembered every moment she'd forgotten. The silence before her mother died, the echo of Elric's laughter when he was small. Wilhelm felt the weight of all the ledgers he had kept, each number a life not lived. Agneta saw herself as a child, burying time in the soil with seeds that never bloomed. Rutha saw herself at the beginning, before speech, before name, watching the stars through the wooden beams of a thatched roof. As they reached the top, the staircase dissolved beneath them. They stood not in a new place, but in every place. Time was a plain now, wide, endless. The sky was neither light nor dark. The horizon bent softly inward, like a smile. In the center of the plain stood a door, simple, wooden, familiar. They recognized it. It was the door in the eastern wall, only now it led home. The voice returned, quieter now. What you borrowed is returned. What you kept, you carry. They passed through, and found themselves in the castle once more. The spiral in the courtyard was gone. The clocks were silent. The air smelled of dust and pine. Elric stood by the window, holding a cup of tea. He looked up and smiled, as if they'd just returned from an ordinary walk. "Breakfast?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Outside, the sun was rising, truly rising, not stalling, not spinning, just rising. The castle felt different, though nothing had changed. The windows opened to skies that moved. The hallways echoed again, softly, naturally, without distortion. And yet, something deeper had shifted. The silence was no longer heavy. It breathed. Marta walked through the courtyard where the spiral had once been. The grass there was unmarred, yet the shape of the spiral still lived in her memory, layered beneath the soil. She could almost hear the faint chime that had once ruled their days. Wilhelm stood in the archives, sorting ledgers that now felt absurd. What was the weight of a debt in a world where time had collapsed and returned? But still, he ordered the shelves, not to restore control, but to remember that things could have order again. Agneta planted a new herb garden. Where once she had grown roots for medicine, she now planted for beauty. The lavender spread wide beneath her hands, and she whispered to it, not spells, but promises. Rutha walked the perimeter of the castle, each step a vow. Her cane tapped the ground in rhythm. She smiled at the crows. Elric joined them with ease, as if nothing had happened. He spoke gently, moved slowly, laughed more often than before. He did not ask what had changed. Perhaps he knew. In the evenings they sat together in the great hall. No clocks ticked, no bells rang. Only fire crackled and stories were shared, some real, some dreamed. On the 7th day, a traveler came to the castle gates. He was thin, wrapped in gray, his eyes clouded with forgotten years. He spoke of a strange chime in a distant forest, a bell with no bell tower, a door in a tree that led nowhere. Marta led him to the fire. They listened, and when the story was done, she smiled and said, "You're safe now." The castle held him too, and outside time passed, not quickly, not slowly, just as it should, but the peace was not stillness. On the 8th day, Marta wandered to the edge of the forest. The trees felt closer now, leaning in, as if listening. There was a stillness to the world, but it was a living stillness, like a held breath before bloom. She walked the path where once the spiral had begun. The earth was soft beneath her boots. A bird trilled in a pattern she couldn't place, until she realized it matched the rhythm of the 13th chime. Inside the castle, Wilhelm began carving again, not ledgers or notes, but spirals into scraps of wood. He did not know why. He only knew it brought quiet to his hands. Rutha started writing down her dreams. One in particular returned, a library of doors, each marked with a date that had not yet come. In her dreams, she always chose the same one, August 19th. She didn't know why. Agneta lit candles in the chapel again, but now she left them unprayed over. She watched the flame dance and remembered not words, not moments, but feelings, warmth, wonder, a time before knowledge. Elric began painting. Murals appeared on the castle walls, a garden that bloomed in darkness, a staircase of bone turning to light, a clock split in two, bleeding gold. They didn't speak of what had happened, not directly, but the spiral was in them now, in how they moved, in the stories they shared, in how they listened to silence. More travelers came. Not many, just enough, all with stories, all with something lost or found. Some stayed, some left changed, all were welcomed, and one night, long after the harvest, Marta stood alone in the tower and heard it again, not a chime. Not quite, but something like it, a reminder, and she smiled, not because it was over, but because it wasn't. The spiral had no end. Years passed. The castle aged quietly. Vines crept gently over stone, not to consume, but to decorate. The spiral never returned to the ground, but those who lived there no longer needed it carved. It was in their hands, in their breath, in how they paused between thoughts. Marta grew older. She no longer kept the glass watch, but she remembered it. Its weight, its stillness. She taught the children who came to the castle how to listen for time, not to measure it. They called her Keeper. Wilhelm became a historian of silence. He wrote no books, but tended a room filled with blank scrolls. Visitors came and sat with him, and often they left crying, not out of grief, but recognition. Agneta never left the chapel. It became a greenhouse, filled with light and vines and bells made from glass that rang in breezes no one else could feel. Rutha disappeared one winter and returned 3 days later with a smile and a new cane. She never said where she went, but afterward she walked without pain. Elric's murals faded over time, but beneath the peeling paint, new images always surfaced, ones no one remembered painting. The castle gained a reputation, though not the one it once had. It was not haunted. It was remembered. And deep beneath its foundation, where stone meets root, something turned once more, not to end a cycle, but to begin another. The spiral turns, always,